It's really nice that you are here with me. We are just in the National Institute of Mental Health, where I normally work, and it's great to have you with us because you're a researcher from the Yale School of Public Health. You have a long record of researching minority stress and LGBTQ and sexual minorities' mental health and well-being. So I would like to ask you just at the introduction, why did you choose this research focus? Why was it interesting for you to start researching sexual minorities' health?
Mm-hmm. Well, sexual minorities are one of the highest risk groups for mental health problems. In every country where this has been looked at, they experience at least, they have twice as greater odds of experiencing things like depression, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders. And when I first was in graduate school, it became clear that this was a really pressing public health issue that needed a lot of good research to understand. And so the timing was just right for me to get involved in helping contribute to greater understanding of why those disparities might exist.
Mm-hmm. And so you have a lab also in New York City, right? Mm-hmm. It's called STEAM, if I'm right. Yep. What it stands for?
STEAM doesn't stand for anything in that case. It's a group of researchers, students, and colleagues who are all dedicated to understanding the sources of mental health disparities that LGBT people experience. And the reason we have a lab in New York and not in New Haven, where Yale is because we do a lot of treatment research, and we seek to deliver these treatments to lots of LGBT people to test their efficacy and ultimately to disseminate them. And because New York is such a large city with a vibrant LGBTQ community, it makes sense to do that work there.
Okay. One of the most important research that you've contributed to is the research on minority stress theory and on function of minority stress and how it affects the well-being and mental health of sexual minorities. So, if you wanted to explain to us what minority stress is, so that everyone, common folk, everyone will understand that, how would you describe minority stress?
Well, simply, minority stress is the added stress that minority group members in society experience that majority group members don't. So in the case of LGBT people, those are things like growing up concealing their sexual orientation, growing up with the feeling of difference or not belonging, growing up with anxious expectations of rejection, knowing that society has stigmatizing attitudes towards people who are heterosexual or cisgender, and those added stressors add on top of the stressors that everyone experiences, like daily life stressors, to exacerbate LGBT people's risk for mental health problems.
Right. So quite a lot of those phenomena you mentioned are connected to the process of coming out. Mm-hmm. So that we can maybe say that the actual coming out is a stressful process, and it's containing some of these stressors you were mentioning. So can we say that there are some things that can help people to go through coming out so that it is less stressful?
Mm-hmm. Well, coming out is something that may always be stressful, even if stigma didn't exist. Recognizing a difference about yourself, and especially a difference that involves sexuality, and then disclosing that difference to others might always be a stressful process. Mm-hmm. And for most LGBT people, that process takes 7-8 years between the time they first label their differences, maybe gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and first disclose that difference, which often happens in early adulthood. So that's a period of time, 7, 8, 9 years, where LGBT people know that they are LGBT, but haven't told another person that. And a lot of my research has looked at what the consequences of that are. And the consequences can be deep. and they all impact mental health. Sometimes in negative ways, but sometimes in positive ways. The experience of being able to, the experience of having been in the closet and navigating one's identity in relative isolation can also give LGBT people a lot of insight and a lot of empathy for similar populations that might experience.
So these adaptations can be also some positive aspects, like connected with a strengthened ability to adapt to different environments, etc.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But you asked what we could do to make coming out easier. Mm-hmm. I think the surest way to make the experience of coming out easier would be to create equitable societies where LGBT young people see themselves reflected in social institutions like marriage, like religious institutions, as members of families, etc. But as long as there is unequal protection and unequal rights for LGBT people, LGBT young people don't have those models, those visible models of thriving LGBT adults, and that makes coming out hard because one doesn't know what kind of world they're entering into. Some LGBT young people might see coming out as like an existential death sentence, where when they come out, they'll be labeled, they'll be stigmatized as someone who doesn't have much of a future. But in fact, LGBT people do have futures, and they have quite remarkable, diverse futures. But as long as that's not reflected in the things that young people
institutions,
see, right? It can be really damaging to LGBT people's mental health. To the extent that schools are protective, and to the extent that teachers, even if they're not openly gay teachers, to the extent that they serve as models of tolerance, of diversity and inclusion, to the extent that they stand up to bullying or teasing and make all kids feel included, then the LGBT people will have an easier time coming out. And all kids, gay or straight.
This is actually an interesting point you're making. In one of my papers, I've also focused on homophobic bullying. And we ended up with an understanding that if homophobic bullying is a learned behavior and it is often practiced in school, then maybe we can also change schools into vehicles of change so that we can unlearn homophobia.
That's right.
So that's you are mentioning that the schools can act as these important institutions for the change, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So you were also mentioning the institutional environment, and you mentioned marriage as an important sign. So we have these small pins on us, and these are called a SMEFER, which is the name of the Czech Marriage Equality Coalition campaign, where 6 NGOs, including Queer Geography, that is part of this coalition, is trying to convince the Czech government to actually accept the marriage equality. And its English translation would be "We are fair." So would you think that this kind of stressing of fairness, so that we have the same potential, same chances, same opportunities, is one of those chances, one of those vehicles that can alleviate the stigma related to being sexual minority?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the lack of fairness is stigma. They're the same thing. And when you create more fair social institutions, like when you allow everyone to marry the person they love, then you've eradicated stigma. Like stigma operates through these institutional influences, with marriage being a big one for LGBT people.
Yeah, here in Czechia, we are often discussing that sexual minorities feel themselves excluded from the whole society on the basis of they do not have access to same opportunities, because there is a specific institution that is called registered partnership, and it only gives certain rights, so it's like kind of halfway, and many people do not want to enter this relationship, this institution, because they feel that this would exclude them. So, did you have a similar experience in the U.S. before it got the marriage equality?
Sure. I mean, without marriage equality, governments and countries send a clear message to LGBT people that they're second-class citizens. And you know, as long as you have one set of opportunities available for one population, an inferior set of, a more constrained set of opportunities available for another set of population. That's the definition of stigma, it's the definition of discrimination, and we know that, we know very clearly that has negative health effects. There was some very good research done in the U.S. showing that when populations in different U.S. states voted against marriage equality, that the mental health of LGBT people really suffered for years after that.
So it got worse. And do you have some data on, for example, what happened after the marriage equality was introduced?
It got better. LGBT people became healthier. They were, they became physically healthier, they became mentally healthier.
So we can scientifically substantiate that marriage equality introduction has a positive effect of mental health of LGBT people.
Very clearly. There have been numerous studies that have documented the influence of those type of what's called structural stigma, that have documented the harms of structural stigma and the benefits of reducing it, specifically for LGBT people and specifically around the issue of allowing LGBT people to marry.
So if I come back to the minority stress and that we know that it's causing the ill effects in mental health of sexual minorities, there might be people who will want to ask a different question like, okay, so if we know that sexual minorities have higher prevalences of depression, anxiety, and suicide rates and substance abuse, for example, cannot this be attributed to some trait that is specific to sexual minorities per se? So that cannot this be some kind of essential biological trait? This is probably a question that I will get often during my research. So how would you respond to that?
I would just say it's simply not true that we know that LGBT people experience more mental health problems because of the greater stress they experience. This has been shown across hundreds of studies, not just in the U.S., but in many places around the world, that the only plausible explanation for greater mental health problems among LGBT people is because of stress. Now, unfortunately, that greater prevalence then gets used by people who want to deny LGBT people equal opportunities to say, well, this population is pathological. But that argument falls apart pretty quickly, both under empirical scientific scrutiny, but also under...
Already like during 80s, right?
Or even before that.
Okay.
It also falls apart under moral scrutiny. I mean, you would want to help people who experience more mental health problems. And when you know the source, regardless of the source, but when you know that the source is stress, you actually have an easy point of intervention.
Thanks for making that clear. So there's another question that is closely related to the function of stigma and minority stress. You said that this is influencing the openness to way or the degree to which people closet their or conceal their sexual identities within some societies. We often want to measure the proportion of sexual minorities or non-heterosexual or LGBT people within the society. We want to know how many percent, whether it is 4% or whether it is 5% or whether it is 10%. And structural stigma has a strong voice in this because it is influencing it. Can you make it like can you tell us how it is influencing this
Sure. I mean, but first this question of how many people are LGBT, like we have to question the motivation for wanting to know that. Even if LGBT people made for a tiny, tiny fraction of the population, it doesn't really matter for we don't want to deny the existence of those people. If the goal is to show, well, there's a ton of sexual minority people because they exist everywhere, well, that also doesn't matter. I mean, the truth is that sexual minorities are everywhere, and that they're randomly and normally distributed across the entire global population, such that on average, from the best possible estimates, and most of those estimates come from Western countries, the best possible estimates show that about 4% of the general population identifies as LGBT, and that a much larger percentage reports same-sex attractions and same-sex behavior, maybe even up to 10% of the population. What stigma does is suppress people's ability to have an identity that's aligned with their behaviors and attractions. And our research shows that in countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, that have high degrees of homophobia.
Such as Russia or other countries?
Places like Russia, for example. That the vast majority of LGBT people, even if they're having same-sex sexual behaviors and even if they report strong same-sex sexual attractions, aren't going to identify as LGBT.
So they rather identify within the questionnaire as a heterosexual?
As heterosexual, yeah. Because the costs are just too great otherwise. But we know that the proportion of these people, we know the proportion of LGBT people.
We know that they are there, but we just know that they don't report themselves to be
that how they identify
sexual
publicly
minorities.
Is determined by the environments they live in.
So it is a function of structural stigma, and so without us knowing the amount of the stigma or the minority stress within the population, we cannot really measure correctly the proportion of people. Right. And at the same time, we always have to question why we are measuring the proportion, why we do need to know, because as you mentioned at the beginning of this answer, that it is sometimes not justifiable to know, right?
Right.
Okay.
And we may never truly know, because sexual orientation is such a fluid phenomenon that's determined by so many forces. That even people who identify as one thing today may not identify as the same thing a year from now.
It's a construct. It's a social construct. Sexual orientation. I would vote for understanding that we have sexuality and that we can kind of have different kind of desires, and until these are healthy, then we should not stigmatize them.
Yes, right. That's true.
So this is, maybe we will come to this understanding in some time in the future. So is there something that I've maybe missed in this short interview, and that would you like to tell to Czech viewers? We will put subtitles to this in Czech later on. So is there some message that you want to send to the Czech viewers?
Well, from my experience here, Czechia seems relatively inclusive and tolerant. And as a country that could continue serving as a model for places that aren't as inclusive and tolerant. So to the extent that Czechia can continue making progress in supporting LGBT people, including by things like just providing LGBT people the same opportunities that everyone else has, including, for example, the right to marriage, then it can really serve as a model for neighboring countries and countries around the world that are looking to increase its tolerance of all of its diverse population.
Thank you for accepting my invitation, and I really look forward to meetings in the future.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.